14 missed calls in 8 minutes on Thanksgiving night, and I let every single one go to voicemail, because I already knew what they wanted, and for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't going to give it to them. At that exact moment, my daughter Melissa, my son Trevor, and my son-in-law Blake were standing in the parking lot of a shuttered restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, staring at a locked door with a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Me. I was 400 miles north in a rental cottage on the Outer Banks, listening to the tide come in, a glass of bourbon sweating on the porch rail beside me. They thought the restaurant had made a mistake. They were right. That mistake was 22 years old, and every year it had my name on the receipt. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 63 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I was known in my family as the man who made the holidays happen, not the man who enjoyed them, the man who funded them. My wife Carol passed almost 11 years ago now, cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes is, and after she was gone, holidays became the one thing I clung to, because they were the one thing that still felt like her. Carol used to say, the holidays weren't about the food or the decorations, they were about everybody being in the same room at the same time, and for a while, that's exactly what Thanksgiving was for us. Simple. A turkey, a folding table extended with a spare leaf, mismatched chairs dragged in from the garage, and my 2 kids arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Then Melissa married Blake, and Trevor started making real money at his firm, and somewhere in there, Thanksgiving stopped being a dinner and started being a production. It didn't happen all at once. The first year after Carol died, Melissa suggested we go out instead of cooking, said it might be easier on everybody, easier on me especially, and I appreciated that. I really did. We went to a nice steakhouse downtown. I picked up the check. Nobody thought twice about it. That's just what a father does. But the next year, the restaurant had to be nicer. The year after that, we needed a private room. Then it wasn't enough to have a private room. We needed the restaurant with the view of the harbor, the one that required a deposit just to hold the reservation. By year 5, we weren't going to restaurants anymore. We were renting them out entirely, buying out the whole dining room so Blake's parents could join, so Trevor's girlfriend at the time, and later his wife, could bring her side of the family too. What started as 6 people around a folding table became 22 people around a room I paid to reserve, a menu I paid to customize, wine I paid to have flown in from a vineyard Blake liked in Napa because, in his words, the local selection was beneath the occasion. I want to be honest with you, whoever's listening to this tonight. I didn't mind the money at first. I had it to spend. Carol and I built a good life, the kind where a comfortable Thanksgiving for 22 people didn't put a dent in anything. What I minded, what started eating at me slowly over the years, was that nobody ever seemed grateful. Not once. Every single year, something was wrong, and somehow it always traced back to me. One year, the wine wasn't chilled enough, and Blake made sure I heard about it twice. Another year, Trevor's mother-in-law didn't care for the seafood course, and Trevor pulled me aside like I'd personally offended the woman. Melissa, my own daughter, once spent an entire car ride home listing everything that had gone wrong with the catering. The appetizers came out cold. The band played too loud during the toast, and never once, not one single time, did she say thank you for putting the whole evening together. I used to lie awake some nights after those dinners, running through the whole day in my head, wondering what I could have done differently, wondering how to make the next one better, more polished, more impressive, so that maybe, just maybe, somebody would look at me across that enormous rented table and say, "This was wonderful, Dad, thank you." It never came. What came instead were text messages the following week about how the centerpieces looked cheap in photos or how the DJ played the wrong kind of jazz. I told myself, every single year, that this was just how families were, that kids complained, that stress made people short with each other, that next year would be different, smoother, better. Next year was never different. The complaints just changed shape. And here's the thing I didn't let myself see for the longest time. The thing that finally cracked open in front of me last year, sitting at the head of a table I'd spent nearly $11,000 to set. Nobody at that table ever asked how I was doing. Nobody asked if the anniversary of Carol's passing, which always falls 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, was hard on me that year. Nobody asked if I even wanted to keep doing this enormous, expensive, exhausting tradition that had ballooned into something Carol never would have recognized. They asked one thing, every year, in one form or another. Is everything taken care of? Is the room booked? Is the good wine coming? That was the whole conversation. Taken care of. Like I was a vendor they'd hired, not a father, not a man who used to build blanket forts in the living room with these same two kids. Last Thanksgiving is when it finally broke all the way through. I'd rented out the entire second floor of a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a harbor view Carol would have loved, and I'd hired a 5-piece band, because Blake mentioned once, just once, almost a year earlier, that live music made an event feel elevated. I remembered that. I remembered every offhand comment any of them ever made, because remembering was how I showed love. That was always my language, paying attention to the small things and turning them into gestures. Dinner went fine. Better than fine, actually, for the first hour. Everyone was laughing, the wine was flowing, Trevor's youngest was running around the dance floor in her little velvet dress, and for a few minutes, I actually let myself believe we'd made it through one, just one, without a single complaint. Then Blake stood up to make a toast, and somewhere in the middle of it, his phone, the one he'd set on the table to record the moment, slipped off the linen and cracked against the hardwood floor. The screen shattered. Blake stared down at it like it had betrayed him personally, and then he looked over at me. "Harold," he said, "this floor is a disaster. Somebody could have mentioned it wasn't carpeted." I looked at him, confused. "It's a restaurant, Blake. The floors are hardwood. I'm not sure what that has to do with your phone." He shook his head like I'd missed something obvious. "You booked the room. This is exactly the kind of detail you're supposed to think through." The table went quiet. I felt my face get warm. That particular kind of warm that comes right before you say something you'll regret, or right before you finally say something you should have said years ago. Before I could respond, Melissa jumped in, and this is the part I keep replaying. "Honestly, Dad, this is what always happens. Something always goes a little bit wrong, and it's never anybody's fault but yours somehow." I stared at my own daughter. What does that mean exactly? I paid for this room, the band, the wine, the food, all of it, and somehow the hardwood floor existing is a failure on my part? Trevor, God bless him, didn't even look up from his plate. "You always find some way to almost get it right," he said, quiet enough that I almost missed it, loud enough that I didn't. Almost get it right. 22 years of almost getting it right. I sat there, at the head of a table I'd spent $11,000 to set, surrounded by people wearing clothes I'd essentially paid for, given how much I'd been covering every year, drinking wine I'd flown in because of a comment Blake made in passing, and I felt, for the first time in my entire life, completely invisible. Not a father. Not a man who'd raised these two people, who'd taught Trevor to ride a bike in the church parking lot, who'd walked Melissa down the aisle. Just a checkbook with a pulse, sitting quietly at the end of the table, waiting to be told what he'd gotten wrong this time. The dinner kept going. The band kept playing. Somebody refilled my wine glass, and the conversation moved on like nothing had happened, because to them, nothing had. This was Tuesday. This was normal. This was just how Thanksgiving went. But something in me had gone very still and very quiet, and it stayed that way the whole drive home. I sat alone in my kitchen that night, the house too big and too silent the way it's been since Carol passed, and I asked myself a question I'd never let myself ask in 22 years. What would happen if I simply stopped? Not stopped loving them, not stopped showing up, just stopped being the one who made it all happen, stopped being the safety net nobody thanked me for holding. The answer came to me almost immediately, and it felt less like anger and more like relief. Next year, they'd get exactly what they'd actually planned for, which was nothing, because none of them had ever planned anything in 22 years. They'd simply expected. By the time October rolled around, I'd almost let the whole thing fade into the background of a normal year. Almost. Then the family group chat lit up the way it always did, right on schedule, a few messages about where we'd go this year, somebody floating the idea of trying someplace new, and within days, it wasn't a discussion anymore, it was a wish list. Melissa found a restaurant in Charleston, an old plantation-style building converted into an event space, gorgeous photos, string lights strung across a courtyard. "This could be really special this year," she wrote. Not, "Can we afford this?" Not, "Dad, would you mind covering it again?" Just an assumption, stated as fact, the same assumption that had been running underneath every single conversation for over 2 decades. Blake started sending links a few days later, a specific brand of tequila he wanted for the toast, a photographer he'd seen on Instagram who apparently only did intimate luxury events. Trevor's wife wanted a specific florist flown in from Savannah, because the local arrangements, in her words, always looked a little sad in photographs. The old version of me would have pushed back immediately, would have called a family meeting, would have laid out a budget and gotten frustrated when nobody respected it. I didn't do any of that this time. I read every message. I liked a few of the photos even. And I said absolutely nothing about who was going to pay for any of it, because in 22 years, that question had never once needed to be asked out loud. Me. Always me. I let the deposit deadlines pass. I let the emails from the venue go unanswered, one asking politely for the remaining balance, then another, a little firmer, then a final notice. I read each one and close my laptop. Meanwhile, I made a reservation of my own, a small cottage on the Outer Banks I'd found online, nothing fancy, 1 bedroom, a wood stove, a porch that faced the water, the kind of place Carol and I used to talk about retiring to before she got sick. I packed a bag, loaded up my old Lab Duke into the truck, and drove 12 hours south alone. The first night felt strange, I won't pretend otherwise. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz with some minor holiday emergency that would somehow be my responsibility to solve. Instead, there was nothing, just wind off the water and Duke snoring by the wood stove. I spent the days before Thanksgiving walking the beach, cooking simple meals for one, reading a novel Carol had recommended to me years ago that I'd never gotten around to finishing. I didn't miss the big dinners, not really. What I realized, walking along that cold November shoreline, was that I'd never actually missed the dinners themselves. I'd missed the idea of what I'd always hoped they would become. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and quiet, a light mist coming off the water. I made coffee, took Duke for a long walk on the empty beach, and had the most peaceful holiday morning I could remember having in over a decade. But all day, I kept glancing at my phone, not out of worry, but because I knew something the rest of them didn't. I knew exactly what time they were expected to arrive at that restaurant in Charleston. I knew the final balance had never been paid. I knew the photographer had already been let go for lack of a deposit. So while the day moved quietly around me, I found myself checking one thing again and again, the time. Because I understood, better than anyone, exactly when the truth was scheduled to arrive. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the whole story that matters most. At 6:15 that evening, my phone lit up. Melissa first. I watched it ring twice, then stop. 10 seconds later, it started again. Before that call ended, Trevor's name appeared. Then Blake's. Then Melissa again. Within minutes, my screen looked like it was having some kind of electrical seizure. Call after call. Text after text, each one stacking on top of the last. I set my coffee mug down on the porch rail and watched the names scroll past. Right on schedule. The first text from Melissa read, "Dad, call me back right now." The second, a minute later, "Seriously, where are you?" Then, from Trevor, a wall of text, with more capital letters than punctuation. Then from Blake, short, clipped, furious. I finally opened one voicemail, Melissa's voice, tight and cracking. "Dad, the restaurant says there's no reservation. They say the balance was never paid. Everyone is standing outside in the cold. Please, just call me back." The floral order had also fallen through. No florist, no photographer, no band, because the deposit for that had lapsed back in October, right around the same time Melissa had written, "This could be really special this year," without ever once asking who was footing the bill. 22 people, standing in a parking lot in Charleston, South Carolina, on Thanksgiving evening, staring at a locked door and a whole lot of nothing. The messages kept coming, more frantic with each one. Melissa wanted answers. Trevor wanted someone to blame. Blake, predictably, wanted to know who he needed to yell at. What struck me hardest, sitting there on that cold porch with the ocean going dark behind me, wasn't that they were upset. It was that every single message carried the exact same assumption underneath it. That I would fix this. That I always fix this. Even now, even after months of silence on my end, even after every deadline had quietly come and gone, their first instinct wasn't to solve the problem themselves. Their first instinct was to call me and wait. I could have called the venue myself, right then, and probably smoothed something over with enough money thrown at the situation fast enough. That's exactly what the old Herald would have done, the one who spent 22 years quietly rescuing every holiday before anyone else even noticed there'd been a problem. Instead, I stood up, walked into the little kitchen, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I came back out to the porch. The phone kept buzzing on the railing, call, text, voicemail, call, text, voicemail. I let it. For the first time in over 2 decades, I simply sat there and listened to the silence between the notifications, because I'd finally learned that sometimes the loudest thing you can say to your family is nothing at all. If you've ever sat somewhere quiet, watching your phone light up with people who only ever seemed to need you for what you could fix, then you already understand exactly what that silence meant to me on that porch. After almost 45 minutes, I picked up. Melissa's voice came through first, high and strained. "Dad, what is going on? Why isn't anything paid for? Everyone's freezing out here." Before I could get a word out, Blake cut in from somewhere behind her. "This is completely unacceptable. Do you understand how embarrassing this is?" Trevor's voice, quieter, more careful. "Dad, seriously, can you just tell us what happened?" I let the noise settle for a moment. Then I asked one simple question. "Did any of you pay the deposit on that restaurant?" Silence. "Did anyone pay the florist? The photographer? The band?" More silence. Longer this time. Then Melissa, quieter now. "That's not really the point, Dad." I almost laughed, out there alone on that porch, because that was exactly the point, the entire point, the only point that had ever mattered in 22 years of Thanksgivings. "I always assumed whoever planned the evening was paying for it," I said. "That's usually how it works." Nobody answered. For the first time in as long as I could remember, nobody in my family had a comeback ready. "I want to say something," I told them, "and I need you to actually hear it this time. I was never the one who almost got it right. I was the one who paid to make it look right every single year for 22 years, and somewhere along the way, all of you stopped seeing the difference between the two." I told them about the $11,000 from the year before, about the wine flown in because of a comment Blake barely remembered making, about lying awake trying to figure out how to make a holiday better for people who never once asked if I was doing okay, especially in that stretch of November that still, every single year, brings me back to losing their mother. Nobody apologized, not that night. A few sharp words got exchanged, Blake mostly, and then the call ended the way these things usually do, with more silence than resolution. But something had shifted. Something that had been sitting on my shoulders for over 2 decades finally wasn't there anymore. The days after were quiet in a different way than I expected. There was some anger at first, a few messages accusing me of embarrassing the family, of being petty, of turning a holiday into some kind of statement. Trevor, to his credit, called a few days later, not to argue, just to talk, and it was the first phone call in years that didn't end with him asking me for anything. As the weeks rolled on, the anger cooled into something quieter. Nobody sent restaurant links this year around the holidays. Nobody mentioned florists or photographers or the right kind of tequila for a toast. The old assumption, the one that had run underneath every single conversation since Carol died, had finally been broken. I won't tell you everything got better right away, because it didn't. Melissa and I still have some distance between us that I'm not sure will ever fully close, and Blake, I imagine, will never quite forgive me for that parking lot. But something else happened too, something I didn't expect. The calls that still come, they feel different now. When Trevor calls on a random Tuesday just to talk about nothing in particular, I know it's not because he needs something from me. And I'll take one of those honest, unhurried phone calls over 100 perfectly planned holidays where nobody ever once said thank you. Looking back on it now, sitting in my kitchen with Duke asleep at my feet, I can tell you the best Thanksgiving I've had since Carol passed wasn't any of the big ones. Wasn't the harbor view, or the 5-piece band, or the wine flown in from Napa. It was a quiet cottage on the Outer Banks, a wood stove, an old dog, and a porch that faced the water. It was the one Thanksgiving in over 2 decades where nobody could find something to blame me for, because for once, there was nothing for me to have gotten wrong. Here's what I keep coming back to, more than anything else from all those years. I always thought being generous meant never saying no. What I've learned, a little too late maybe, is that real generosity needs boundaries sitting right next to it, because the moment kindness turns into an expectation, gratitude tends to quietly walk out the door behind it. So if you're listening to this tonight, son, daughter, husband, wife, whoever you are, wherever this finds you, I'd ask you to sit with one honest question before you decide anything else. Do the people around you still say thank you, or have they simply started assuming you'll handle it? Sit with that a while. Don't rush the answer. If you think I was right to let the silence do the talking instead of confronting my family head-on, tell me one in the comments. If you think I should have said something years earlier, long before it ever got to that parking lot in Charleston. Tell me 2. And if you're genuinely torn on the whole thing, tell me 3. And tell me why, because I'd really like to hear it. I'd also love to know if any of you have ever had to quietly step back from a role your own family handed you without ever once asking if you wanted it, whether that role was the money or the fixing, or simply always being the one who showed up no matter what. If any part of this found something in you tonight, I'd be grateful if you passed it along to somebody who might need the reminder that boundaries aren't cruelty. They're just honesty, finally given the chance to speak. That parking lot in Charleston didn't ruin anybody's Thanksgiving. It just finally showed all of us who that holiday actually belonged to.